Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay. Well, welcome to today's session, everybody. And in this webinar, International Education Specialists, the Lygon Group, will provide real-time insights into international student sentiment towards Australia's international education sector. And this will be drawn from their award-winning social listening platform, The Social Source. The Social Source is an exciting platform which is revolutionising how we monitor international student sentiment in real time. We're lucky to have two of the employees from the Lygon Group with us here today to present the webinar. We have Angela Lehman, who's Head of Research and Media at the Lygon Group. And Angela's an expert in global higher education with a rich career in research, policy, analysis, and international education in Australia, China, and the UK. She joined the Lygon Group in 2020, and she's a go-to international education expert in Australian and global media. We also have Varsha Balakrishnan with us here today, and Varsha's the head of student insight and strategy at the Lygon Group, and she really brings the student voice to the fore. Joining the Lygon Group in 2021, Varsha is a driving force behind the Lygon Group Social Source platform. And this year, Varsha won IEAA's Tony Adams Rising Star Award, and she holds 2 master's degrees from Monash University. So thank you so much for joining us today, Angela and Varsha, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you guys for joining us, and thank you English Australia for organizing this. I think Ange and I are super excited to be speaking with you all today. Just to give you a brief overview of how we run the session, I'll take you through a little bit about what the Social Source is, and then we'll jump into Destination Australia, which is actually a subscription that we run for Australia, which captures on a month-to-month basis what are international students saying online and what are they saying to each other about Australia as a study destination, after which Ange will take you through the market insights focusing on China. Next slide, please. So for our TLG student insights, most of it is driven by social source. When we say social source, we're actually tapping into online open source platform and the conversation students are having with each other. And in our subscription service, we have a number of reports, and the key areas we cover are quality of education, living and logistics, education outcomes, competitor destinations as well. So for Australia, that would be predominantly Canada, US, and the UK, government, community, and support services. Next slide, please. So why social insights? This actually came out of a space during the pandemic where we were struggling for answers, and we really needed to understand what students were thinking about in real time, what were their key concerns, and how do we as a sector address it. So we started this as a pilot, and it's grown in the past 3 years to win the Innovation of the Year at IEAA. So that's been pretty incredible. But at the heart of it, it's really about tapping into real student voices, their narratives, their problems, their successes, and turning that into sector-leading actionable insights. So we're really focused on the student experience, the student voice, and the student journey here to drive actionable change for the sector. On a monthly basis, we get over 1.5 million results. Of that results, we go off the engagement that each student has over an original post. When we say engagement here, we're talking about likes, retweets, comments, resharing, putting their own thoughts to it. And that's how we drive the insights that powers our reports and the insights that we provide. So next slide, please. when we talk about the international student cohort here, it's really important to note that we don't see them in silos. And in the online sphere, they're actually able to communicate across cohorts. So you have your current students talking to your recent graduates, but also your past students that may be offshore or in another study destination. You also have prospective students and parents being able to tap into current student experiences to inform what decisions they should be making. And on the side of that, you also have your recent graduates and your 485 holders. Now, this is just focusing on the student cohorts. On the side of this, you also have your migrant community, you also have your local community informing students and speaking to students online. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the topic government here, and we've gone through and actually tried to make this more ELICOS focused and to bring out and give you an understanding of what students are saying in terms of English language, English tests, and anything related to their visas. So with this, students are a bit struggling a little in terms of applying to do an English language course and waiting extensive number of months without any clarity or certainty around whether their visas will be granted. And they're looking to each other to get an understanding of how quickly is a student visa granted for an English course and how long should they plan ahead to apply for their visa so they can actually come on time to start their courses and be able to also factor in time to find accommodation and just adjust to Australia way of life. There's also discussions around English competency, and you can see here, these are all actual comments from students, and we always put this in your reports to give you a sense of what their actual voices are and how they are narrating their situations. So you see here a Nepalese student saying that they're coming to do English in Australia before doing their bachelor studies, and they are worried about how do they prepare to talk to others. And you also have international students reacting to these comments saying that basic English and basic English competency is incredibly important to them because it also affects their quality of learning and their quality of life when they come to Australia. And you also have students that are desperate to come to Australia to study. And so they are just asking for an opportunity to come in and be given that chance to prove themselves and really learn English here. Then you also have students that thinking towards their 485. Some students have gotten credits off their bachelor's and are wondering, they don't meet the requirement to get their 485 and are wondering whether their English course actually counts towards the number of weeks required. I think that's 92 weeks if I'm getting that right. And are all English courses also Christ course registered? Because that's also another stipulation for them to be able to use their English course towards their 485. So having a sense of where they can get this information and credible information will be incredibly important for international students based on visas, postgraduate visas, and PR as well. Next slide, please. In the space of living and logistics, there's quite a few things happening here, but cost of living has always been a big one, and it's been a big one since probably mid last year, and it's growing in terms of intensity. So with international students, the cost of living struggle, how do they balance work and studies is something that international students always ask about. Is there a realistic estimate of how much a student can expect to earn before they come here? Prospective students especially are keen to know what's the expected amount so they can budget accurately and not fall into the problem of coming here and running out of funds and not knowing who to turn to. Students are also desperate to work and get part-time employment, but they struggle because they don't have prior work experience in Australia. And also they are trying to get a sense of the rough timeline of securing part-time jobs. In terms of housing and accommodation struggles, this again is a big one. Students are struggling in terms of where can they find safe and secure accommodation that's not going to break the bank. And current students are finding that, the rent keeps increasing. Prospective students are looking at this like, how can I budget and what is the rough budget that I should have in terms of accommodation? And also how early should I come to Australia to actually give myself time to find the right accommodation for me? Next slide, please. quality of education is another big focus around international students, particularly with the return on investment and the juggling the fact that they are also balancing the high cost of living. So casual teaching staff affecting quality of education. Students are actually sharing that they are more and more aware that their lecturers and their tutors are changing ever so often, and they're picking up that there's more and more sessional and casual tutors and lecturers, and they realize that institutions can do that, and that does not universities or institutions are not really taking into account that it affects the quality of the education that international students are receiving, especially given the high amount of fees that they pay. So they're actually digging into, what percentage and what ratio of a academic staff are actually casuals, and making course decisions or study decisions based around that. What is the longevity of a casual staff at a university, for example? They're also digging quite heavily into QS rankings, and these things are interesting to me as a prior international student. When I looked at the ranking back then, I didn't quite question it, but you have a student cohort that's incredibly intuitive and inquisitive as to why things are the way they are. So when QS ranking came out and they saw that Australian universities were ranked quite highly, and some better than Yale or in comparison to Yale, that just sparked a whole lot of debate as to what's the validity around the assessment criteria for this ranking. Is it research driven? Is it marketing? So students are actually poking holes in rankings, and whilst rankings are regarded quite highly, we also see a cohort of students that are coming up that are questioning rankings as, is this just a marketing incentive, or what's backing the research that drives rankings? With quality of education, there's also a discussion coming out around vocational and TAFE opportunities and whether that leads to better employability outcomes. And this goes back to the theory versus practical discussion that's been happening as well. Should students be focused on rankings and a university name, or should they actually be focused on practical skills where they can apply themselves to a job? Next slide, please. In terms of quality of education, and specifically around the ELICOS sector, we've been able to extract some of the conversations and comments students are actually sharing with each other. And there seems to be a lot of hesitancy around the ELICOS sector, just because students have fallen into the cracks and are sharing that you should avoid certain things. For example, here, there's an English and a vet package with similar prices. And end of the day, I think the crux of it comes down to the price point that makes certain courses seem more enticing over others. But you also have current students saying, avoid opportunities like this that are presented to you, because if some deals are too good to be true, they are often something that you should avoid. You also have students that actually have gone through and said there are some very dodgy ELICOS schools out there, but there are also some very, very good ones in every piece of research I've seen. So you see students here actually conducting the research, and they know that they go to English Australia, they go to NIAS, and they realize that it's actually no difference between a private provider and a university. While some students recommend going to a university just because of the reputation and the safety around it, you have other students saying that actually it's okay to go to a private provider. Then it leads to a question of, how can students identify reputable ELICOS providers, and how can students identify quality private providers that have the quality of learning in mind and have the end outcome of the international student in mind, as opposed to it being a revenue generating stream. So you can see that students are actually doing research. They're heavily understanding, who are the regulatory bodies. They know about English Australia. I didn't know about English Australia till I came to Australia and I was working within the sector. And these are all prospective students back home deciding where to go and how to do an English course. Next slide, please. For education outcomes here, again, a big discussion in the last year or so PR pathways are super important to international students. However, they realize that it's not as easy as you see it on immigration website, Home Affairs, saying that you got to do this bare minimum, and they're realizing that bare minimums don't cut it. But on top of that, you have students struggling to actually secure full-time jobs in their relevant field after graduating, just because there's always a stipulation of citizenship and PR requirements on those jobs. So students are asking, how can they navigate this space and navigate around the fact that they actually need to prove themselves to employers who aren't open to hiring international student graduates? How can they navigate this space to actually make a case for themselves that they are a value add to the company? And you also have students wondering whether an English course equals better likelihood of getting a job. Coming to Australia and learning English, for them, they feel like they'll get the accent more accurate, they'll be more confident because they're actually learning to speak English in the country that they want to get a job in. So you have students wondering whether an English course, despite being able to speak English and possibly learning English their whole life, would be beneficial for them from an employability side of things, just to give them the confidence to navigate and hold conversations with interviewers, employers, or even just networking. Next slide, please. Part of the social source, we also monitor community sentiment. When we say community sentiment, we actually monitor domestic students, international students, local community that international students live in, and also in their workspaces, and see how they mesh together, how they interact, and we pick up areas where there is growing tension and monitor the growth of social licensing as well. So there is rising negative sentiment towards international students. Some locals are sharing that, international students are just working in aged care, for example, because that's a skills gap, and it leads to them getting PR, and therefore the system's broken because not many of them would stay in those aged care sectors. So there's a lot of speculation as to the behaviors of the international student just for PR versus the actual benefit that they actually provide whilst being in the aged care industry. And the big thing is the rental crisis that's running through all of Australia, is that there is this tension between domestic and international students and locals as well, that they're competing for these rental properties. How can international students navigate this space where they can secure safe accommodation for themselves, but not be discriminated against when they turn up for a rental property inspection, or when they turn up for, a room share opportunity? There's also international students dealing with racism and discrimination, and this happens in the workplace, but also on campus. And you can see here at the bottom, you have a student saying that I'm doing an English course, but I've spoken English my whole life. I failed my IELTS a few times because my accent wasn't right. My tutor is so condescending, and the way she speaks to us is quite appalling. There's a difference between being spoken to and spoken at. I dread this so much. So you can see that even though the quality of education might be excellent, if the tutor comes in and doesn't have the cultural nuances, international students pick that up fairly quickly. And in the early days, they either learn to love their course or they dread being in that course. So that, from a academic point of view, from a tutoring and lecturer point of view, is incredibly important to make sure that the academics understand how to navigate that space with international students. And international students are such a diverse community. It can be tricky to deal with, but end of the day, that impacts their student experience. Next slide, please. And this will be my last slide before I hand over to Ange. In terms of support services, I think the biggest thing that international students are talking about is a strong need for community. We've seen since students started coming back, they had to navigate the space of hybrid learning, or fully online to hybrid and then face-to-face, and students being just drained from COVID and not having having been in lockdown or having been away from people for so long, the struggle to assimilate back, I think we all felt it when we went back to offices and when we have big conferences, that we feel mentally and emotionally drained. And so are international students, and they're juggling work and studies on the side as well. They're really looking to forge a good sense of community and a good sense of belonging within the local communities that they live in, whether that be the broader Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and also Australia. They're wanting to build ties to Australia and their local communities, but they're really struggling to do that. So they're actually asking their peers online, where can they meet friends, and is there a platform for them to be going through? And for students that are struggling mentally, they have peers that are actually recommending them to go to the GP to seek help. And for those that do that, they're expressing long wait times for mental health support, which adds on another layer of stress. And then when they take the step further and they want to, they get a mental health care plan and they want to figure out what is covered by their student health cover, they run into an added layer of stress where they are faced that they're going to have to pay for it out of pocket and then figure out after they submit a claim how much of it that the provider will cover. And that is an additional financial burden on top of their emotional burden that they're already facing. So these are just some things to keep in mind, and where possible, provide support for international students or just more social events or more cohesive learning experiences for international students to get to know one another in the classroom setting as well. That's all from me. I'll take questions once Angie's done. Ange, over to you.
Thanks, Varsha, and thanks to English Australia for having us and hosting us today for this webinar. I'm going to take you down a slightly different direction now. Varsha's been speaking about the social source and the conversations that are happening between students, prospective, current, and past that are going on about their experiences and impressions of studying in Australia. I'm going to speak more specifically about China now. So part of what the Lygon Group does is that we also do what we call market insights. So we're looking and taking a deep dive into what's happening in specific places in terms of drivers for international education. China, of course, is a very complicated and complex place, particularly when you're talking about social media, of course. So we run our China research program at the Lygon Group slightly separately to the rest of our research, because it necessarily needs to take a different methodology due to the restrictions and tight internet kind of ecosystem in China. Today, I just want to, in my brief bit of time, I want to talk to you through the post-COVID context in China, what young people are going through, what has changed, and a lot has changed. The Chinese students and families that you're dealing with now are very different than they were 5 years ago. So I'll run through some of those key changes that have happened that have direct impact on our sector. I want to talk about what this means, particularly for young people. So how are young people dealing with a lot of the changes that have been happening and are happening? I'll talk about the student and youth sentiment. So what are they saying? What are they talking about? I'll specifically mention the English language sector, and particularly around some of the policy changes and the forecasting that's going on there around that sector. And then I'll finish off, if I have time, with some opportunities and challenges. So we'll see how far I can get. Just to kind of briefly go through what's happening in China right now and has happened over the last 3 to 4 years is incredibly profound on many, many different levels. So it's not just COVID. COVID's a part of this crisis, or this not crisis, but this changing context in China, but it's one of many that we're seeing now. So we've certainly had a lot of economic changes in China. You would have been reading in the papers around what's happening there. There's what we call deflation happening in China, which means this the opposite, of course, to what we see here in Australia, where instead of the prices going up at the supermarkets, they're going down, which sounds great, but it's really not, because what it means is that people are hesitant to spend their money. So middle classes in China right now are not spending. This doesn't necessarily mean for us that there is reduced money there within the middle classes, but what it means is that there's an increased hesitancy to actually make financial decisions and make spending decisions. So I think that's really important for us to have an understanding of, and I think it's behind some of the reports of a slower return of students post-COVID, is this general sense of economic uncertainty and anxiety. There's a bunch of other kind of economic changes that are going on there. I won't spend too much time on, but generally things like the mortgage crisis, or the real estate crisis, for example, in China, where a lot of families have invested their money in real estate, and now that sector has really kind of gone through a big crisis, and people and middle class families may have lost some of their spending capacity as well. Social change. There's a lot of social changes going on in China at the moment, and I like to, when we're doing our China research, really just focus on the things that mean something for our sector. Like what can we say from what's happening in China that may impact students making a decision to come here or to study with Australia? In China at the moment, we have a tightening up ideologically in China, with President Xi really trying, on the one hand, to really kind of enforce a new wave of patriotism in China, be very proud of China, and to be pushing forward made in China, and that the education in China is as good, if not better, than countries around the world. So there's a new sense of pride, or a renewed sense of pride, I guess, in China. There's a demographic crisis happening in China right now, which means that there are forecasts that China's working age population is going to be going through a really problematic time in terms of numbers of people that are going to be able to work. So China's facing a massive problem where they know that in the future they need skilled workforce. So this inevitably means that they need to be producing graduates that are suitable for their workforce needs in China right now. So there's two different things going on. At the same time, we've got this kind of closing up ideologically, and this real kind of focus on, okay, we need to really work on building up China's workforce. But at the same time, there is a renewed recognition that China does need engagement with the rest of the world. It needs its international partners. And we've seen that in recent weeks with visits, high-profile visits with Biden and Albanese and so forth. Certainly, we're seeing some of this closing up as well as the opening up thing happening, the two different sides happening at the same time in recent weeks. And this kind of has implications for English in particular, and I'll go into that in a little while. Institutional changes. So we've seen Chinese universities climb rapidly through the ranks in recent years, particularly this year in the latest rankings. Chinese universities have done very well. There's also some changes policy-wise that are trying to shape how the future of the university and the tertiary sector goes, in terms of building up the quality as opposed to quantity of students that are going through universities. And I'll mention a little bit more of that as we go. Policy changes, I'll talk about that a bit later. Geopolitical change, of course, we've had a tough time in this country with China in recent years, and that has had an impact on our sector, I think, in terms of this general sentiment within China towards Australia. In China, I guess, we're really talking not just about the geopolitics, but we're talking about how welcome do mum and dad feel? How safe do mum and dad feel sending their child to Australia? And that's the kind of the everyday, I guess, kind of interpretation of geopolitical tensions. So, and we know that in recent times, some parents and families might have felt a bit hesitant about sending their child to a country that is considered not friendly to China. So in recent weeks, we've seen some significant signs of positive opening up and hopeful rejuvenation. There's certainly a sense of optimism in China around re-engaging with Australia, and in Australia re-engaging with China. So I think this is a really good time to be revisiting China, to be going back in there, to be forming and working on those partnerships that you have, and to be really kind of making that move to get back into this market if there has been some setbacks. Because of all of these changes that are going on, and they are complex, but they all do have some potential opportunities for Australia in terms of new markets and new cohorts of Chinese students. But there's also challenges. We've got a hesitant market with reduced potential spending capacity. We also, because of these changes, are seeing new cohorts of students that might have different career ambitions, different course selection priorities, for example, so there's changed opportunities for Australia. Now, in terms of how this impacts young people, one of the major kind of changes and phenomenons that we keep our eye on at the Lygon Group is what's happening with the youth unemployment rate in China right now. You may have seen that youth unemployment is at record high rates. It's sitting around apparently around 25%. That's between 16 and 24, so it's quite a young cohort. But the Chinese government have in recent months stopped publishing that data, and they're finding there's different ways to kind of interpret unemployment data, which is indicating actually that this number is actually far higher than 25%. Part of the problem is this rapid growth of the Chinese university sector that has happened over the last 15 years is now producing more and more highly qualified university graduates who are now coming out of university, and there simply isn't the jobs in a post-pandemic China to actually support careers for these people. Now, this is a problem because young people without jobs creates not a great positive feeling and sentiment towards the government. So it's definitely a priority area for the government, and there are various kind of methods and policies that the government are trying to resolve this crisis. Not all of them are popular with Chinese young people and their family. As a result of the very, very challenging times that young people have been through in China over the last 3 years, there's a rising awareness of mental health in China. I have never really, I've worked in universities in China for many years, and I've never really heard discussions about mental health. I was in China 2 weeks ago and engaged with a lot of universities, and it's just a hot topic. Everyone's talking about how to provide mental health support, what's needed, what well-being is for students. Certainly, Chinese universities are facing pressure and targets to deliver services that they've never really needed to in the same way before. That's a bit of an aside, except to say that students coming to Australia will have this on their mind as a priority when they're choosing. It's certainly something that's been spoken about. Runshu is a philosophy and a kind of a trend that happened throughout the COVID years, and it basically means the philosophy of running away. Young people started to discuss how they didn't feel that their lives were going to mean anything. They were working hard for so long during their childhood, and they didn't see a great potential future for them ahead. So there became a rise in young people discussing how to leave, how to get away. And this is, of course, has certain amounts of opportunity for us. Lying flat is another side of that kind of sense of disillusionment around young people in China, where young people felt, well, what's the point? I just may as well give up. So there's a real sense of kind of hopelessness and depression amongst a lot of young people who feel that they've worked very hard, been through very hard COVID lockdowns, and are now coming out of high school or university with limited prospects that would be different to what they had imagined when they were younger. So this is a kind of sentiment that we're seeing a lot of online when we look at Chinese social media and what students are talking about. This kind of sentiment is heavily monitored by the Chinese government, so the language tends to get shifted as certain terminology does get restricted, but it certainly has been a prominent feature of Chinese young people conversations over the last years, and it's something Australian institutions would do well to be aware of. So just to go through a little bit in terms of the kinds of topics that students are talking about in China right now, the overall theme that sums up a lot of this is exhaustion, or the term henlei or lei. The first one is around the real estate market. So this is kind of, a lot of young people are talking about people losing money, The only party without fault is the home buyers, yet it's this blameless group that bear all the losses, which is truly absurd in this society. So we're seeing this kind of discontentment a little bit there. Job market disillusionment. They've fabricated so much that they've even lost confidence in their own narratives, and this is around just a sense of mistrust in the information that the government is willing to share around the true nature of the job market in China. Educational policy inconsistencies. This relates to, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I'm sure most of you in this call might be aware of what's called the double reduction policy, which is around the banning of extracurricular learning, particularly English language learning. This is being met with real skepticism by many young people who are saying that they're just trying to pander to people who are underachievers, and it's not really going to help us to develop a skilled workforce by restricting the ability for young people to access extracurricular learning. And of course, educational and emotional strain, and this goes back to my earlier point around this kind of sense of anxiety in young people right now. I'm almost graduating from university now, but the memories of my time studying in a country town in Henan still send shivers down my spine. I can never forget how helpless and isolated I felt then. It's some pretty kind of negative sentiment that we see a lot within the young people at the moment in China. Now, there's been, just in terms of what this means for us, the kind of the so what factor, we see what we can see is that recently, when something happens in China, if they release a new kind of national security law, we noticed this last year when there were protests happening around the COVID regulations. In last months, we've mapped this sentiment or interest in immigration against when there's been an announcement about a new national security law that came out few months ago in October. There was a new national security law that came out that said that that you should no longer do things that might offend China. The law was very, very vague, and it scared people because they weren't quite sure what the law actually meant, but there was a general sentiment that things were kind of tightening up ideologically. When you look at when that announcement was made about this new law, you see a real spike in internet searches for immigration. So there's certainly a sense of movement there. Now, I'll just got to keep my eye on the time. I'll go really quickly through this because I'm sure you guys will all get access to the slides. Just a few policy changes that have happened. This double reduction policy, which is the one I just mentioned, which happened a few years ago. So there's been this restriction on the English language sector in China has been really, really struggling in the recent years since this policy came out. Nevertheless, the Gaokao examination, which is the high school finishing exam, still requires English language. So parents are not particularly happy with this. We still need to have high levels of English to complete and to get into universities, but no longer are students able to access the kinds of learning support that they had beforehand. In recent months, we've seen some universities, not all, but some starting to scrap English test requirements to complete universities. Xi'an did this, and there's been a few more since then. So now the Ministry of Education have never required universities to put an English test in at the end of their course, but many universities do have this. But this is certainly going to trickle on, and we can expect to see more universities not requiring English language proficiency to complete their course. There's one here too I wanted to mention because I think it's really interesting. There's a new policy that's come out that says they're called the Zhongkao examinations. This is to enter high school. Previously, there has been a number of people that repeat their high school entrance examination because they didn't get the result that they thought they would get. From next year, this is no longer allowed. So you are not allowed to repeat your middle school entrance examination. Now, the reason I mention this is because English language is a requirement to complete your middle school examination. But from now on, you will not have a chance to repeat that unless you are enrolled in a private school. Now, how this will go, I'm not sure. But what I do know, and I think we can agree that the parents are still very keen on English language proficiency. They want their child to have good English language. It's feeling very much that they're not getting much support to be able to support their child to develop the English language skills that they think that their child should have. So I think these are actually policy changes that they're complex, and it's still early days to see how they'll go, but I think certainly that there will be opportunities within some of these changes. Very, very quickly, just some of the work we do at the Lygon Group is looking at new cohorts of Chinese students. These are 3 that we're mapping out: escapers, delayers, and savers. I think in terms of English language, this delayers group is very interesting here. These are students who are looking to avoid the hyper-competitive job market by continuing to study for the time being. These are students who will be looking for, when they're studying, when they're going abroad, to be doing things that will enhance their employability on return. So certainly increasing and improving English language would be seen as one of those. Challenges. I will leave this slide with you. These are challenges that we see for Chinese students with learning English, and for the market, the English language sector, specifically around Chinese students. Chinese students often view English primarily as a means to pass exams. So they focus on test strategy rather than language proficiency, which I think could cause some gaps once they come to study in Australia. There's just skipping down to the bottom here, stereotypes and limited exposure to Australia. There are misconceptions about Australia, which is influenced by stereotypes and media censorship, which can affect students' perceptions and choices. So this is just a piece around pushing the marketing now, particularly when we are at a moment around positive and new energy in the China-Australia relationship. Opportunities, certainly market potential beyond the major cities, and I'll hopefully have time to briefly mention one of the services the Lygon Group offer around that. Addressing resource scarcity in smaller cities, certainly there's huge opportunities when we're stepping outside of Shanghai and Beijing, but knowing where to look, of course, is not always easy. There's some shifting youth trends and ambitions that we map at the Lygon Group, such as, for example, what are young people talking about in terms of what do they want to do when they travel? And we see recently opportunities for institutions in Australia to be working with their tourism bodies and local governments to be building up marketing and promotional material around something called a city walk, for example, where students do like to explore their city off the beaten path. They like to be able to find the trendy hidden coffee shop and things like this, things that are not necessarily the traditional tourism sites. So there's just new interesting trends that can be really, really useful in terms of shaping up comms and marketing. I'm just conscious that we want to leave time for questions. So this is just a little map we've done in terms of online study for people searching for online study in Australia. Where are they? Where are they based? Where are their pockets of opportunity for Australia in terms of where are there people searching and potential room to grow? Now, just in terms of what we do with our market insights, we offer monthly reports. So we go through what's happened in China this month, some key data, could be around labour market, could be about policy changes, something. And we, of course, put in the top trending issues that Chinese students and Chinese young people are talking about on social media. These come with quarterly briefings. We do rapid responses. So if something happens in China, you know it instantly. And this is all accessible via an online portal. A new product we're releasing soon is called Regions in Focus series. So we're going to be digging down deeper into some of the provinces that might not be so familiar with people, to have a look at their international their education sector, including ELICOS, and their higher education sectors as well, and see where there are pockets of opportunity for Australia. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Varsha, are you jumping back in now, or can we go to the Q&A?
Yep, we can go to Q&A.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Varsha. The data you presented was fascinating and definitely very sobering at times as well. And Angela, the information you presented on the post-COVID context in China, especially for young people and how they're dealing with changes, was extremely thought-provoking for us and for ELICOS providers. So thank you to both of you. So if people have questions for our speakers, please put them into the Q&A. We do have an initial question for you, Angela. So someone has asked, well, they've commented that you noted that youth unemployment officially or now unofficially was around 25%, with pressure building due to the volume of graduates now and in the pipeline. Do you see this as a risk or an opportunity for Australia? So, for example, will more students be seeking postgrad opportunities, or could it lead to a loss of value in education?
I was going to say, whoever asked that question, that is spot on. I mean, I think that's it's such a great question, and because I think certainly to address first of all the opportunities, yes, I think there are opportunities here. In many ways, we've seen recently in China a very steep rise in students sitting the postgraduate entrance examination. So that's just gone through the roof because students are coming out with their undergraduate and they're thinking, oh, goodness, what am I going to do? I'm going to go into postgrad study. Now, there's not enough places to... I know we all think that there's thousands and thousands of universities in China, and there are, but there's still not enough places to accommodate all the students that want to sit their postgraduate studies right now, and they're not opening up anymore. So you see the rise of people sitting the postgraduate entrance exam going like that, and then it's just not increasing in terms of the numbers of places available. So not everyone who wants to do postgrad studies is going to be able to, and that's why I feel when we're looking at new cohorts, because we're looking at people who may not have previously considered study abroad. So, and there's opportunity there for English, because these might be students who hadn't been internationally educated in international education kind of streamlined through from the beginning. They might be people who were just thinking now, oh, this is a good time for me to actually step abroad, but I might be lacking in certain skills in order to do that. So certainly in the first instance, I think opportunity. The second part of that question is around, is it going to actually have the opposite effect? And that's true as well, because what we're seeing now is that because the market is so competitive in the job market right now in China, we're seeing a decline in job advertising, job ads that are stipulating that they are looking for an international graduate. So there's a sense that an international degree is not as valuable in all jobs as potentially it used to be. So there is that conversation going on right now. And we see this online. We see students talking a lot about return on investment, this conversation around, is it worth it? Am I really going to get a job when I come back to China? Streamlining on from that are conversations around work placements, internships, careers, all of these extra bits that sit around their education experience in Australia. And the bits that I don't think we traditionally focused on in a Chinese market as much as some of the other markets, now we need to. This is the time where Chinese students are definitely looking for all of those work experience, and their job enhancement skills are going to be front and center. And again, I guess opportunity for English and ELICOS sector there too.
Okay, thank you. And I guess you've spoken about some of the opportunities there. There was a question from Simon for you, Angela. He's thank you for the great presentation. And his question is, what are the negative stereotypes that young Chinese may hold about Australia or the West that we need to counter?
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and certainly the Chinese messaging in recent months has increased in terms of its negativity about the West generally, I suppose, in terms of there being an anti-China sentiment, I suppose, and a heightening of propaganda and patriotism within the media and messaging. That's really hard for us to counter. So what we can do, though, is think about where does it impact Australia specifically. I think in terms of Australia, there's maybe negative sentiment around just this constant political thing, but we've got another challenge on top of that, and that's just raising awareness generally of Australia being a place, an opportunity for students to come and learn English that is close by, that is safe, that is welcoming. So it's really just that almost creating getting our word out there when we're competing with such big brands such as Canada, the US and the UK. Australia is kind of sometimes not heard as loudly in that context. In the English language sector as well, we have this very kind of strange obsession with accents in China, that students feel that if they learn English in England, they'll have an English accent. They learn English in America, they'll have an American accent. An Australian accent is not really considered to be a good accent to have. So it's breaking down some of those stereotypes, I suppose, around about what Australia is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in the classroom, we're always countering those stereotypes around accents, and we definitely, say that we teach international English for communicative competence in a global environment. So maybe we do need to get that word out there a little bit more strongly. Thank you, Angela. Varsha, there's a question for you. In the student discussion points, it was noted to avoid ELICOS courses with fees similar to VET courses. Is there any correlation between students' perceptions of quality and price? Could lower fees lead to perceptions of lower quality?
Thank you for the question. I think it's about, so I think there's a race to the bottom in terms of prices, and students have caught wind of that. So if the market is priced generally at this level, what does a lower fee entail? Does that mean a loss of quality? So they're questioning how can an institution provide a lower fees, and what's being lost out there? So I think students are trying to get an understanding of do we just generally charge higher fees, and when certain institutions or private providers charge lower fees, they're not compromising on cost, they're just making it more affordable, and making it more affordable doesn't compromise quality. I think that's what students are trying to understand here, because they're so driven by, okay, you know what, if I go to, say I went to Monash, for example, I know that they're going to charge a hefty fees, and I accept that because of the reputation. So if they're going private providers, if they are new to the ELICOS sector, what are some of the key things that they should be looking out for from a provider that they can say, okay, this is quality education, irrespective of the cost. I know that this institution, this provider is going to do right by me. And I think that's where English Australia is so primed and well positioned to be providing that information to drive their decision-making factors.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And of course, it was really good for us to see that some students are undertaking their research before coming and are finding English Australia and indeed NEAS data as well. Varsha, another question for you. There were some interesting insights related to ELICOS courses and gaining employment.
Yeah.
Is this something that providers could leverage off? Or do you think that students might see this type of promotion as false or misleading?
I think that's a double-edged sword. Just being fully honest, I think that there is value in potentially packaging that up as a course, an English course or a short course that goes on to a bachelor's degree, where you're just helping them in terms of workplace transition. I wouldn't necessarily call it an English course. I would call it sort of a workplace transition or integration in the workplace type of thing, where they are essentially building their confidence. It was more of a professional development thing as opposed to English language. And I think that's the key that students are looking for. They want to gain confidence in terms of, how do I speak to an employer? How do I network confidently? And having that done through a provider that does English just adds on that level of satisfaction that, hey, I'm getting that English competency, but I'm also getting that confidence, and building that two together, I think it's really important in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the cultural and, networking opportunities that come with undertaking an English course here in Australia.
Yeah.
The next question, it could be for either of you. Angela, it's about China, so I'll address it to you. Are you hearing anything about fraudulent English exams coming out of China in particular?
Certainly it's something we have heard about. I haven't heard anything specific to China. Having said that, I think there have been some rumors kicking about that there have been cases of this happening. I don't have data on it to hand, but certainly I would be wary of this. There's been a few cases as well of not just English language fraud, but just general application fraud, not really fraud, but universities pressuring students to apply internationally so that they can keep their postgraduate figures up, if that makes sense. And I know that some institutions across Australia have noted this, that applications from students in this context of coming out of university, no job, university says, we need our graduates to say that they're going somewhere, so why don't you apply for this course and so forth. But I definitely think that this is an issue that is real and that we need to be monitoring. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We do have quite a lot of questions left, but we've probably only got time for one more. Angela, I think we were all really interested in when you spoke about the reduced focus on English in primary and high schools, but still the expectation of English levels at Gaokao being maintained.
Yes.
This does present an opportunity for English support to be provided. However, there seem to be restrictions on English classes being offered to younger cohorts in China. Are these restrictions still in place?
As far as I'm aware, yes. And I think, this double reduction policy was there a while ago, and we are seeing not just in terms of the double reduction policy, but policy moves which are really trying to build locally led, locally run curriculum in China. We can wait and see on that, because and I'm just kind of hypothesizing, but I suspect that things might loosen up a little bit around that, because certainly there will be a decline in quality of English learning without the support and without the engagement that they've been able to take advantage of previously. I think what we're seeing here is a problem where we've got parents and students having a very different idea of what they want to what the government restrictions are now putting in place. So I don't think that's going to last forever in some ways, but certainly at the moment it's quite restricted.
Okay, but watch this space, I guess.
Yeah, I think so, and certainly it's one that we're tracking as well. Okay.
Just very quickly, somebody's asked about your region of focus and monthly report for China. How could that help English language teaching professionals?
Yeah, great. It's really around which regions in China is there untapped need in. So we know in China, some it's kind of not all educational institutions and not all educational landscapes are governed by the national level and by the MOE. We have the provincial level, and then we have the municipal level. So these regions in focus reports will have a look at a particular province which we think has some potential, but also specific needs. So we'll be looking at what's the state of what kind of universities are there, what kind of English language institutions or levels are there in these places. Where are the skills gaps and skills needs in those places, for example? Where are the government identifying that there is a need for a particular skill set? And also some of the particular regulations that might be in place around those provinces. So at the moment, we've identified 3 provinces that we're going to kickstart with, and they all show a very different kind of perspective on China. So, you know, with different needs, different regional kind of nuances that need to be taken into account when you're marketing towards a particular region, for example, or if you're trying to form partnerships or relationships with institutions in those regions. So we're positioning this as a package of 3 reports, which will be fairly very clear and accessible. A lot of the problem with dealing with China in this sector is it's complicated and there's just so much to get through. We try to cut out all of the noise and really just give kind of clear, accessible information. And in this case, it's the first time we've run them, but we're going to choose 3 provinces, or we have chosen 3 provinces, which we think will be really, really interesting.
Okay, thank you. We've just popped the Lygon Group website in the chat as well. And indeed, that really nuanced data sounds like it would be very useful. We do need to finish up now. I'd just like to thank Angela and Varsha again. This has been an incredibly insightful session, also very exciting to hear about the social source. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, so I was really happy to hear about how it works and hear all of your insights as well, Varsha, from what you've gathered from the social source. Thank you again, and thank you to everybody for coming along today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.